At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine underwent a catastrophic failure. The explosion released radiation contaminating hundreds of thousands of square kilometers across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, forced the permanent evacuation of the city of Pripyat and its 50,000 residents, and sent radioactive particles across most of Western Europe. It is one of the most consequential industrial accidents in recorded history. You know the human story. But there is another story inside this one. A story that lived in the ledger books of the Kremlin rather than in the medical records of the hospitals. It is the story of what Chernobyl did to the financial architecture of the Soviet state. Of how an explosion in a reactor became a slow poisoning of an empire's immune system. Of how the most powerful military force on Earth discovered, in the years that followed April 1986, that it could not afford the cost of its own catastrophe. The explosion did not fall on a healthy system. It fell on a system already bleeding from a wound it had not anticipated and could not control. The Soviet economy in the mid-1980s was built on a foundation of hydrocarbon exports. Oil and natural gas were the hard currency that connected the USSR to the international economy, the assets that could be sold abroad for dollars and then used to purchase the technology, grain, and consumer goods the domestic economy could not efficiently produce. The petrodollar era of the 1970s had been extraordinarily good for the Soviet budget. Rising global oil prices had filled the treasury, funded the military buildup, subsidized the satellite states of Eastern Europe, and allowed the Brezhnev government to postpone difficult questions about the structural efficiency of the planned economy. When oil was expensive, the system could paper over its own contradictions. Then, in 1985 and 1986, global oil prices collapsed from around $30 per barrel to under $10, driven by a combination of Saudi production increases and weakening global demand. For the Soviet budget, which depended on hydrocarbons for a substantial fraction of its hard currency earnings, this was not an inconvenience. It was a structural crisis. The revenues funding the empire's operating costs had been more than halved. The giant had feet of clay, and the ground had just shifted beneath them. Gorbachev's government was in the early stages of trying to manage this revenue collapse when the reactor failed. Chernobyl did not cause the Soviet financial crisis. It landed on top of one that was already developing, and it accelerated the trajectory toward collapse with a force that the system had no capacity to absorb. The 18 billion rubles was the Soviet government's own internal estimate for direct costs through the late 1980s, a figure representing a significant fraction of annual discretionary spending, never publicly acknowledged at the time. The real total, incorporating long-term health costs, permanently abandoned infrastructure, agricultural land removed from production, and lost economic activity, was substantially higher. Gorbachev himself, reflecting on the period years later, described Chernobyl as one of the primary financial factors that made continuation of the Soviet system impossible. The costs began accumulating within hours. Helicopters deployed in the emergency response became so contaminated they could never fly again. They joined armored vehicles, fire trucks, buses, cranes, and heavy machinery of every description in the exclusion zone, an extraordinary collection of written-off industrial assets, immovable and dangerous to approach, representing years of industrial production and significant capital investment. The exclusion zone became one of the largest concentrations of permanently written-off equipment in history. Beyond the equipment, the Soviet government faced the challenge of housing the displaced population of Pripyat and the surrounding region. In a country where housing was already chronically scarce, creating residential capacity for tens of thousands of people on an emergency basis was a logistical and financial challenge of enormous scale. Their solution was to build an entirely new city. Slavutik was constructed from scratch, beginning in 1986, absorbing resources from across all 8 Soviet republics. And the largest single category of expenditure was the workforce deployed to manage the contamination of the broader affected area. Approximately 600,000 liquidators, performing physically demanding and medically dangerous work, paid triple standard wages for hazardous duty over several years of sustained operations. The Kremlin was writing checks against reserves it did not have for a crisis it had not planned for. If nobody has told you that Chernobyl was not just a nuclear accident, but a financial event that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union, subscribe now. A command economy already under severe fiscal stress was handed a catastrophe it could not afford. The 18 billion ruble fire is the story of a system discovering that it cannot pay the bill for its own failure. Stay with us. The direct costs were enormous and real, but Chernobyl also destroyed an industry. The Soviet Union had been a leading exporter of nuclear technology, earning hard currency and cementing political relationships with client states across Eastern Europe, Cuba, India, and beyond. After April 26, 1986, that business effectively ended overnight. No government wanting to be able to defend its nuclear program to its own citizens was in a position to procure Soviet technology. An industry generating hard currency and political influence was simply gone. The energy consequences compounded this. Several Soviet nuclear plants were shut down for safety reviews after Chernobyl. The electricity they had been generating was replaced from the Soviet energy system primarily by burning oil and gas. Every additional barrel of oil or cubic meter of gas burned domestically to replace lost nuclear generating capacity was a barrel or cubic meter that could not be sold internationally for hard currency. At the precise moment the Soviet treasury most desperately needed foreign exchange earnings, both to cover cleanup costs and to compensate for the oil price collapse already cutting revenues, the energy that could have generated those earnings was being consumed internally instead. A negative feedback loop with no clean exit. The agricultural consequences added another layer. Contaminated land across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia was either removed from production or continued producing food that the government systematically mixed with uncontaminated produce from unaffected regions, diluting radioactivity to levels below official thresholds. This was presented internally as a pragmatic resource allocation solution. In practice, it meant the government was distributing radioactive food to its population while publicly assuring that population the food supply was safe. The mixing policy was not a secret that stayed secret. Information circulated through Soviet informal networks with the speed that important prohibited information always traveled. Nowhere was the consequence of this knowledge more significant than in Ukraine. The most severely affected territory was Ukrainian. The city evacuated was Ukrainian. The agricultural land contaminated was Ukrainian. The workers sent into the exclusion zone at elevated health risk were disproportionately Ukrainian. The food mixing policy was experienced by Ukrainians as Moscow using their territory, their people, and their health as resources to be managed for the benefit of the larger Soviet system, without consent and without honest communication. Moscow had poisoned Ukraine, and the food mixing policy meant that was a charge the government could not effectively deny. The Soviet Empire did not collapse because it was defeated militarily. It collapsed because it could no longer afford the rent on itself. The costs of military competition with the United States, of subsidizing Eastern Europe, of managing a population across 11 time zones, of responding to the agricultural and industrial underperformance of a planned economy structurally incapable of efficient resource allocation, all of these were already exceeding the system's revenue-generating capacity before April 1986. Chernobyl added an 18 billion ruble fire to a building already financially overextended. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was not primarily a political event. It was a financial one. The Soviet Union could no longer afford to maintain control over increasingly restive satellite states through force. The structure held for 5 more years. And then it did not. There is an image from Pripyat that has become defining. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park, standing still, slightly rusted, surrounded by trees grown up in the decades since the evacuation. The park was scheduled to open on May 1st, 1986. The evacuation happened on April 27th. The park never opened. The Ferris wheel never turned. What it represents in that unmoving stillness is a future that was promised, but never delivered. The money ran out, not metaphorically. Literally, the Soviet state could not pay for the promise it had made to its citizens. History is not over, it is underwritten.